Good afternoon, and welcome to the Rutgers Council on Public and International Affairs. I'm Edmund J. Janiger, the founding president of the Rutgers CPIA. It's an honor to have with us Senator Robert Krueger, who will deliver the Council's inaugural distinguished lecture. Headquartered at the School of Public Affairs and Administration, the Rutgers CPIA is a student-run, nonpartisan organization dedicated to helping better understand policy choices facing the United States and other countries. Let me now introduce Dean Mark Holzer, the chairman of the CPIA's Board of Advisors, without whose support this council would not have been possible. Let me also point out that Dr. Holzer is the founding dean of the Rutgers School of Public Affairs and Administration and Rutgers University Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of Public Affairs and Administration.
Hey, thank you, Edmund, and thank you for taking the initiative to form the Rutgers Council on Public and International Affairs. We are very dependent on our student organizations for the vibrancy and the life of the school and the dialogue that we undertake. So, we now have a substantial organization at the undergraduate level, thanks to you. Just as we do with PAGA. The Public Administration Graduate Association at the graduate level. So that's an important building block for our school. And I think today we are really entering into another dimension of our dialogue in terms of discussing important issues that confront the entire public sector, not just in Newark or the U.S., but worldwide. So this is a cross-cutting issue in terms of immigration that we will discuss today. Senator Krueger is actually one of us. He's a former academic. He's taught at several different institutions, such as Rice and University of Texas and the Lyndon Johnson School. He's been a dean at Duke, I believe. And so he understands the context, he understands who we are and why this kind of dialogue is important, and why it's important to really have someone who has experienced these issues here to comment on them. He's been an ambassador in Africa, and he's seen some of the difficulties of the human condition, shall we say, close up, and I think he's been a real advocate for human rights. So I very much look forward to this discussion. This is going to be the first of a series that the Council presents this year, and I think this is very much a significant marker for us. So I look forward to the senators, the ambassadors, comments, and we appreciate it very much. So, Edmund?
Thank you, Dean Holzer. Senator Krueger is a Renaissance man. He's a Shakespearean scholar, a university professor and dean, a rancher, a businessman, a statesman, and a diplomat. A native of New Braunfels, Texas, Senator Krueger earned a bachelor's degree at Southern Methodist University and a master's degree at Duke. He earned a doctorate in English literature at Merton College at the University of Oxford. He rose rapidly in academia, becoming by age 36 vice provost of Duke University and dean of Trinity College of Arts and Sciences at Duke. Senator Krueger returned to Texas in 1973, where he ran the family business. Senator Krueger was elected to the 94th and 95th United States Congresses, serving as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for Texas's 21st District, stretching from San Antonio to Big Bend National Park. President Jimmy Carter appointed Senator Krueger as the U.S. Ambassador at Large and coordinator for Mexican Affairs in 1979. In 1990, Senator Krueger was selected by the Governor of Texas to fill the Senate vacancy caused by the resignation of the late Lloyd Bentsen to become the 69th United States Secretary of the Treasury. Senator Krueger has been the leading voice on human rights issues. In June 1995, while serving as America's 13th envoy to Burundi, Senator Krueger's convoy was ambushed as he was investigating massacres by the Tutsi army of Hutu villagers. In 1995, President Bill Clinton appointed Senator Krueger as the 10th United States Ambassador to Botswana and the Special Representative of the Secretary of State to the Southern African Development Community. Senator Krueger has written 2 books and over 400 other publications. He holds multiple honorary doctorates. He's currently a visiting professor at Texas Tech University and a consultant on international trade and government relations with a special emphasis on U.S.-Mexican immigration issues. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Robert Charles Krueger.
Well, thank you very much. That's a longer introduction than was necessary, but I kind of liked it. I do thank you very much, Edmund, for that introduction and also for the invitation to serve on a board of advisors for Rutgers Council on Public and International Affairs, and I was honored to accept that. When I was phoned by Edmund who asked me whether I would come and give a lecture, I said, well, what would you like me to talk on? And he said, well, immigration's got a lot of attention right now. Why don't you talk on that? And I said, well, I testified on it 35 years ago, which testifies to my gray hair, among other things. But I said I could talk about that. And then he said, well, maybe you could also talk about your experience of mid-genocide. So I'm going to, I don't know that these two normally fit, but at any rate, they were part of my experience. And I'm talking not as a scholar, but I'm talking as out of my experience in the 2 topics that I'll be talking about, and that is immigration and genocide. So we will go from the controversial immigration to the catastrophic genocide. And as it happens, when I was serving as ambassador at large and coordinator for Mexican affairs in the Carter administration 35 years ago, I was asked to testify at that time. And I'm afraid that my ideas haven't developed much since then, but I don't think the fundamental problems of immigration have changed either. It's easy enough to talk about tariff policy or trade or commercial or even defense, but immigration, I think, though it's essentially a domestic topic in which we don't really have to consult other countries to get approval, is nevertheless one of the most difficult and controversial and painful and emotional issues for domestic policy. And in one sense, the problems today are the same that the problems have been for some time. And I think the reason that it is so controversial is because immigration doesn't concern things. It concerns people, and it concerns who we are. It concerns our identity. Most issues don't affect, we don't feel that my identity is affected by a particular issue that's governmental. But nothing is more sensitive than our own identity. And I think that this applies not only to our individual identity, but our identity as a nation as well. President John Kennedy's last book before he was assassinated was called A Nation of Immigrants. And as he recognized, and I think as we all do, we are a nation of immigrants in the sense that, with the exception certainly of the Native Americans, we or our forebears all came here from somewhere else. And so, having traveled the world fairly considerably, I'd say that few people are more conscious and probably more proud of their identity than Americans. You get Americans overseas and they very much want people to know that they are Americans overseas. And so the question then becomes, we feel we have a privileged position. We feel privileged, most of us, to be Americans. And with whom should we share that privilege? And under what terms should this come? We presumably cannot share it with everyone. And so that's the sensitive aspect of it. Now, obviously along our northern border with Canada, and really along our sea borders, our seashores, we don't really have a problem there of undocumented workers or so-called illegal aliens. But clearly, on our southern border with Mexico, the problems are constant. In 2008, the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement together apprehended over 1 million foreign nationals along our Mexican border. And even so, in that year, as every year, hundreds of thousands of people enter the country illegally through Mexico. And if we ask why do all these people come through Mexico, the answer, of course, is quite simple. I don't think that there are any two countries bordering one another, probably anywhere else in the world, that have as great a disparity in income as the USA and Mexico. It is basically a 7-to-1 ratio. And so if you have people who look from Mexico and they can see people are living 7 times better just across that river, that's painful. But the pain is then accentuated if they know something of their history and know that part of that country used to be part of our country, used to be part of Mexico. You know, I'm one of those Texans that I'm not one who was around when we declared our independence, etc. But we all know that it was once that a good part of it, as a good part of other parts of the USA, were once a part of Mexico. And so, for the person who is south of that border and looking north and seeing only a river to cross, even if he or she crosses and manages to get a job, the job may not be 7 times the wages, but it may be at least 3.5 times. And if it's 3.5, that's a better deal than what they have at home. And so the American workers, of course, the American workers who are citizens can obviously be expected to be resentful because they feel that their own wages are held down by the availability of people who are in the country illegally, and they are put at a disadvantage, and they're competing against people who are breaking American laws. And that is, it's a legitimate concern. I don't think it's not just prejudice, it's self-defense in a way. Now, every house has a door. I don't know of any houses that don't have doors. And the person who is inside the house decides when to open the door and when to shut the door. And the problem, if they want to shut the door, they probably want to shut it at certain times to keep protected and feel protected. And the same thing is true of a nation. Workers inside the nation want to feel that the nation is their own. They want to feel protected by their country. And they should not feel obliged to have others enter their home without their permission. I don't think that is prejudice. I think that is just ordinary common sense. The problem is compounded by the fact that if the person has entered illegally, the foreigner is essentially denied the protections of the law that are given to all U.S. citizens or legal visitors. And of course, the foreigners are unlikely, if someone is treating them illegally, they are unlikely to go to U.S. legal authorities and make complaints. So they are, in that sense, somewhat defenseless in their task. If wages are denied them or something else, they can't go down to the law enforcement people and say, he's not paying me, because they'll be sent away. Similarly, I think the U.S. citizen who does not employ illegal entrants can be resentful that illegal workers may be receiving free education or free health care. As a Texan, I'm particularly familiar with the problems that border cities have on health care, because there are, among other things, a number of places in Laredo and McAllen and El Paso and probably all along the border where women will wait until their pregnancy is just about due, and when they're due, they'll rush over to the U.S., have their baby on an emergency basis in a U.S. hospital, and then the child is born in America. So in due course, that child will then be entitled to U.S. citizenship. Now, all those things defy common sense, but they are common practice. They are what we are living with. And at the same time, it builds up resentments because people who are on, particularly at border areas, they feel that they are paying taxes for schools that are then being attended by people who are non-taxpayers. So these are not just issues of prejudice, in my judgment. They are legitimate concerns. And the problems of a weak border security extend, in my judgment, paradoxically, to citizens of Hispanic descent. And I say that because the stereotype of the poor, uneducated worker who may not speak English well is then extended to Hispanics who have perfectly good education and have perfectly legitimate credentials, but they are sort of judged by others who have entered. And so it's a very tough emotional experience, and it's tough to talk about that. I mean, I always had my strongest support, probably politically, among Hispanics, but I have, and today, fortunately, there are far more. We now have Hispanics in the cabinet. We have Hispanic mayors. We have Hispanic senators. The kind of long-standing prejudice is certainly declining, but I think it is still somewhat there, and I think that it is somewhat accentuated because of the presence of undocumented workers or illegal aliens. So how do we handle this? Frankly, I don't think there's any way, and I guess my mind hasn't expanded in the last 35 years, because this is what I said 35 years ago, and nobody wanted to do it, and nobody will want to do it now. But I think if we don't get something like a national identity card, or something that can show U.S. citizenship at the time of employment, we'll continue to have this problem. I don't see how we will avoid the problem if we don't have something of that sort. And if we have some type of national card that can be used only for at the time of initial employment or something of that sort, then we can hold employers accountable as well as others. But without that, it seems to me that it is simply very unlikely to happen. And I think that if people had to have such cards, then the employer could also be held accountable in a much easier fashion than is the case now. In my judgment, America should continue to be a nation of immigrants. That's what we are. We, look around this room and look at the diversity here. And America is an increasingly diverse and nation, and is, fortunately, I think, able to offer opportunities to many people from many locations. I'm not at all for cutting it off. But I do think that as every house has a door, the people inside the nation have a right to set the standards on whom they want to invite in or not to. And currently the pattern of illegal immigration has undermined our workers. It's undermined some of our social institutions. And in a sense, it even undermines the tenet that all are created equal and that all citizens can enjoy with equal access the fruits and privileges of our democratic institutions. And with that, that sort of concludes what I have to say on immigration. It's my perspective. As I said, my perspective probably hasn't changed much in the last 35 years, but I think the problem has continued during those 35 years, and I think it will continue until we are willing to say that there is something that we are prepared to have either a national identity card for times of initial employment, or something that will allow the employer to be held accountable as well as the person who is seeking the job. And without that, I'm not going to be living another 35 years, but I think 35 years from now, we could count on somebody coming back. And I think if we don't do something of that sort, we would likely have the same sort of problem. Now, I think rather than open for questions and so forth now, I'm just going to turn to the other topic, and that is let me turn from the topic that is just controversial, immigration, to a topic that was catastrophic, and that is the question of genocide. And I want to talk, there aren't a whole lot of people who have experienced and observed genocide firsthand, but I have, a lot of it. And it certainly made its mark on me. And so how did that happen? Well, how do you turn out to be an ambassador who gets sent to a country that has genocide? First thing you do, you lose your Senate seat. That's the guarantee of it. You lose your Senate seat, a Senate seat that had been Democratic for Texas for probably close to 100 years, and I managed to lose it, and nobody's been able to get it back. I'm the last. You're looking at the last relic of a Texas Democrat who served in Washington in a statewide capacity. It will come again. Whether it will come in my lifetime, I'm not sure. But when I lost the Senate seat that I had held, I lost the Senate. Well, I failed to get one when I first ran for Senate after 2 terms in the House. I ran against a man named John Tower, who was a Republican senator, and he got 49.5, and I got 49.3, so I lost by 2 votes per 1,000. But Haldeman and Ehrlichman and others had been very clever. They had established a new party, funded a new party called La Raza Unida. And La Raza Unida took the 1.2% that otherwise probably would have launched me into the Senate, in which case I would probably never have made it to Burundi. And that would have been, for me, a huge loss. I have to say that serving as U.S. Ambassador to Burundi was the richest experience of my life, by far. So I'm going to talk about that. I didn't know much of anything about Rwanda, but I certainly remember well the election night in which I was watching myself go down to Kay Bailey Hutchison by a good margin, and I looked at my wife and I said, I don't even take it personally. I said, the defeat is so overwhelming that I can't take it personally. I phoned Ann Richards and I said, Ann, I'm awfully sorry I couldn't hold that. And she said, Bob, nobody in the state could have held it. That's why I didn't want Benson to resign. I said, oh, you could have held it, Ann. She said, no, I couldn't. Ann was defeated the next election. And so we haven't had a Democratic governor or senator since that time. We are rather small in numbers. The state legislature were outnumbered 2 to 1. And I don't remember what it is in the state senate, but it's probably no better. So the times they are changing, or they have changed. So, but when I was watching those returns come in, I said, well, I guess I'll talk to the Clinton administration and see what they have in mind, or might have in mind. And I said, I had the privilege. My parents were prosperous, and I said I had the privilege of going around the world twice and living overseas 5 years. And I said, I've given up most of my financial well-being for the privilege of public service. I mean, there's nothing more expensive than a campaign if you pay off your debts, and I paid them all off personally if I needed to. So, but I said I think I'll talk to the administration. So Clinton's chief of staff was his longest lifetime friend from Hope, Arkansas, and Mac McClarty. And I had known Mac before, and so I went to see Mac, and I said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, well, whatever can be genuinely useful. I said, I'm not looking for a title, I'm just looking for a real job. But I said, if there were an ambassadorship that, that were available that would be appropriate. He said, well, Bob, London is gone, and Moscow's gone, and Paris is gone. I said, Mac, I said, I'm not looking for white gloves and chandeliers. I said, I'm just looking for a real job. It doesn't matter to me that the prestigious places are gone. I'm just looking for something that's real. And so he said, well, let's see. And the Clinton administration was very careful about how they did things. They sort of spaced it out, and they got together the president and secretary of state and all sorts of people, and then they would talk about people, and then, you know, if after they finally made a decision, then all the names would get pushed into the next basket, and then they would take up the next. But at any rate, there was a month or so that passed, and I certainly will never forget the occasion, because it was July 7th, which was, I'm married very late in life, and so it was my daughter's 5th birthday. And we were just celebrating, and when the phone rang, and my wife went to the phone, and she came back with her big blue eyes, and she said, "Bob, it's the White House." So I took the phone in the back, and so it was somebody calling from the White House, and they said, we've got a couple of possibilities. Would you want to consider New Zealand? And he said, would you consider Burundi? And he said, that would probably be available. I said, well, give me 24 hours or so. And so I went back in, and I went to the time, what they say? And I said, well, and he said, maybe New Zealand or perhaps Burundi. And my brother-in-law said, Burundi, where's Burundi? I said, well, I think I know, but I said, let's go to the Encyclopedia Britannica and look. Well, I made the mistake. I had this old Encyclopedia Britannica, and volume 24 was the index, and there's no Burundi in the index. Well, it wasn't called Burundi then, it was Rwanda, Urundi at the time of my, so I went roaring down to the public library, and I got, we got Xeroxed a couple of things from something or other, and came back, and it told me about to see war dancers and stuff like that, and and it's this small country right in the center of Africa. The encyclopedia didn't say, but it's sometimes considered the poorest country in the world. It's always among the bottom 10, but it's sometimes considered the absolute poorest I've seen in the entire globe. And my wife said, Burundi, no way, that's an insult. And I said, honey, it's not an insult to represent the United States of America anywhere. And I said, I haven't decided. But the next morning I told her, I said, Kathleen, I know you like the idea of New Zealand, and it's a very beautiful place, but I said, I just intuitively, I don't know why, I feel there's some reason we should go to Burundi. And if you don't object, I'd like this to go there, and I'd phone. So at any rate, from that, it still took, from that July 7th to July 8th phone call, it took until June of the next year to get confirmed. If you're going to be appointed to an ambassadorship, they look at every real estate transaction that you have ever had. They go to the county court and check all sorts of papers. I don't have anything scandalous that I know of in my background, but it took a long time, and at least I think the Republicans are swifter in these things than the Democrats were. But at any rate, but I did get there. But by the time I got there, Rwandan genocide had already begun, and it all seems very familiar to me. And I look around the room and I see people, a lot of them perhaps in their 20s, and it's not that familiar. You would have been a very small child in 1994, but the Rwandan genocide killed, the estimate is, 800,000 people in a country of approximately 6 million to 6.5 million people. It was basically about 1 out of every 7 people was killed in 100 days' time. I mean, if we put that in American terms, it would be like over 300,000 people a day being killed in the USA somewhere. And just calculate that. I don't even know what the population of Newark is, but it wouldn't take but a few days to 1 mil. 1 day? 1 day. I wondered about that, but I asked the taxi driver, what's the population? Nobody else. Taxi drivers never seem to know population numbers, but I thought I could say, thank you very much for saying it for me, that yeah, it's like wiping out Newark today, but somewhere else tomorrow for 100 days' time. And that's what was proceeding in Rwanda. And Burundi is right next door. So that sounds pretty fearsome. They did let me go, but they didn't at that time send over any families, and the families that were there had been brought in Burundi, which is right next door, had been brought back. Now, Burundi and Rwanda are really kind of twin countries. They're right next to one another. They have the same ethnic makeup. They have much the same history. There used to be Rwanda, Burundi, and they were part of when Germany lost in the First World War. Tanganyika became Tanzania, and it went to the British. But the Belgians just got to add on little old Burundi and Rwanda, and so. I don't wish to be too hard on the colonialists, but a good friend of mine pointed out that when the Belgian Congo got its independence, and the Belgian Congo is the size of the U.S. east of the Mississippi. It's not a small place. It's huge, and this is just like an appendix on that great body. But when Belgian Congo got its independence, the country had less than 10 university graduates in the entire nation. The idea that colonialists went in and educated and prepared some is utter bull. It's absolutely false. It is outrageously false. And it's just frustrating that people can still believe that there was one school in Rwanda for the nobility in that country or in Burundi. Otherwise, there were no schools at all when the Belgians left. And unfortunately, because of genocide and some other things, it didn't get much better. But the situation was absolutely horrific for those countries in terms of the development of its people. And historically, when the Europeans went into that section of the world, going back into the 19th century, there were various theories, including some that certain of the tribes in Burundi and Rwanda might be part of the lost tribe of Ham. My Old Testament is not good enough to know who Ham was, but he was evidently around in the Old Testament and was part of the lost tribe. And but what quickly developed, and what probably had existed somewhat before, is that the ethnic differences between the Tutsi and the Hutu are really quite long-standing and probably somewhat predated the Europeans. I can't blame them entirely for that, the development of that particular prejudice. But what happens is that, in simple terms, the Tutsi tend to be taller, they tend to have more prominent noses, they tend to look more like Europeans. And so, therefore, by definition, they are superior, right? And the Hutu tended to be shorter with more pushed-in noses, and they tended to be more the servant class. And so that is absolutely the way it was developed in Central Africa under the Belgians and others as well. But I can't only blame the Belgians, because some of these patterns were present before the time of the Belgians, in fairness. It's important to say that. But the difference was so great and for so long that the tension between these two groups manifested itself over and over again. And the Hutus had actually managed to get control in Rwanda, and the great genocide of 1994 was the Tutsi, basically, with the RPF coming in, and they had, mind you, their leader, Kagame, who, in my, not only in my judgment, but in people who actually know Africa, Kagame is, as one missionary told me who'd been in Rwanda and Burundi 31 years and spoke Kinyarwanda and Kirundi and 12 languages and so forth, and a man of absolute perfect understanding and free of prejudice. But he said, but when I called and asked him once about Paul Kagame, the head of Rwanda, because every experience that I had suggested to me that he was a genocidist, and I said, what do you think of Paul Kagame? He said, Bob, the man is the bloodiest dictator in all of Africa. There is blood all over his hands. And I know that to be true by my own observation. I feel it very intensely, and it infuriates me, frankly, that the United States continues to support this outrageous dictator. But he was trained at Fort Leavenworth by our military, and so he's a hero in our Pentagon. And I think there's probably some CIA things too, but that's another matter. But the pattern of Tutsi domination of the 85% Hutu was very, very clear in Burundi. And Burundi finally had free elections in 1993, and the man elected, Melchior Ndadaye, was a follower of Martin Luther King. He was committed to peaceful nonviolence. He was committed to inclusiveness. And so when he was finally elected, and Burundi went a very long time before they had finally free elections in 1993. But when they came in, he was elected. But on his 100th day in office, the army, which is 100% Tutsi, came in, and putting it in our terms, it's as though the army came into the White House, took the president away, took him over to the Pentagon, bayoneted him to death in the Pentagon, took 6 other cabinet members, all of whom were also Hutus, and killed them, and brought them all for a mass grave right in their own headquarters, military headquarters. And then they figured, the Tutsis figured they'd go right on and run the country just as they had before. Well, that was a bit much even for the United Nations. So they came in and sort of sent in an observer and some other things. But basically, when I got there, you had Hutus who were in office, but they were all ciphers because the military was 100% Tutsi. The police force, the gendarmerie, every judge in the country was Tutsi. There was no Hutu judge. There were the whole professional class. I mean, it was totally a Tutsi controlled country. And during my time there, in a little bit over 1 year, 21 members of parliament were assassinated, all Hutus, one by one, and nobody was ever charged. These are not just serfs. These are members of parliament. I mean, it was just outrageous what was continuing to go on. So, to me, the two-way trade between the USA and Burundi was about $6 million a year. That's almost nothing. There was no political influence they would have. The only thing I thought, what can I do to try to save lives? What can I do to try to save lives and to preserve at least the outlines of democracy to the extent that I can? And frankly, nothing else mattered to me because I didn't think these other things had any consequence. And what I felt was, I represent the most powerful country in the history of the world, militarily and otherwise. And an ambassador plenipotentiary has the authority of the president in that country. And I thought, if I remain silent, who is to speak? I am presumably less at risk than anybody else in this whole country. And so I went out, and it wasn't long, and I need to bring this to a close so that I can leave time for your questions. But initially, I just, I went out and I got all these reports. And if you want reports, you get them. And I can still remember the first time I went out, about 8 days after I got there, and the army had slaughtered 130 people, and then it had covered their bodies with dirt, and then they spread some diesel fuel over it to take away some of the smell. And I went out to this location because there was a group from Amnesty International that got word of it and wanted to look at it. And so we went out, and of course, when we went out, and I was in my car, and I'm a Texan, so I'm driving my car, but we drove out to it, and I can still envision this flat area of soil, and sticking up above it was one leg with a tennis shoe. It's all picked. The bones were all picked except for that, and the scent was still there in spite of the fact that they had spread some diesel fuel to try to take away the smell of death. And that was in my first couple of weeks. Now, my predecessor had been afraid ever to leave the capital, and so he hadn't left the capital in over a year. He'd never left the capital city. He was the chargé, and the person before him had not been to the border, I was told, for 3 years of Rwanda. And these are tiny little countries that are the size of Maryland. So here I was out, and it didn't take long. And then I had a minister come to me, and he said, "Mr. Ambassador, would you go and look, we understand in Budaganzwa that they've had some terrible massacres." I said, I am so sick. I said, I get these reports. I go in to the head of the army, Colonel Bikumagu, and I tell him what I have been told. And he says, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, c'est des rumeurs, ce n'est pas vrai. This isn't true, Mr. Ambassador. It's just all rumor. And so I said, I will go, but I have to have somebody who speaks Kirundi. Kirundi isn't even taught in the State Department. They teach 102 languages, and they don't teach Kinyarwanda or Kirundi. So I had to rely on my limited French, but I would go and see him. So I said, all right, to this minister, I said, find somebody who knows an area, and I will go, and I will dig up graves. I will do whatever I have to, but I will go back, and nobody's going to tell me again it's just a rumor. So I found Prosper Mpawanayo, who's just this fabulous person. You can meet some wonderful persons in a place of genocide. He was a Hutu, and in an earlier period under Michumbero in the 1960s, 1966, Michumbero was determined to eliminate all educated Hutus. And so children were massacred in mammoth amounts and all over in 1966, so that they actually had less than even when I got there, the Tutsi had 90% of the places in secondary school, although they had only 15% of the population. And the Hutus, with 90% of the population, got 10%. But under Michumbero, they got 98% or 99%, because his idea was to wipe out all educated Hutus. So Prosper was a Hutu, and he was going, and he had his doctorate from a doctorate in physics from an Italian university, and so he was found. He was going to go with me to this place in Budaganzwa, and so we were driving out, and I said, "Tell me your story." Now he was at the university when Michumbero was there, and there were a small number of Hutus before Michumbero came in, and he was one of only 2 people who escaped, who were Hutus, escaped killing, and over 100 were killed. And I said, "How did you escape?" He said, "I hid for 40 days in the attic of my aunt's house, because they go around looking for everybody." And he said, I found someone we got a false Zairian passport, as it was at the time. And he said, I was going to go, but my aunt pointed out to me that I couldn't speak Swahili, and so they would know that I wasn't truly a Zairian. And so they found someone else to go with him. And as he made his way, walking the 20 miles to the border to get into Zaire, today Democratic Republic of Congo, they were stopped 3 times by police. 3 times Prosper had to pretend to be deaf and dumb because he couldn't speak Swahili, and the person with him said, he doesn't have the ability to speak, but he is Zairian. He gets to Zaire, he makes it to Rwanda, he goes to Italy, he gets his doctorate in physics, he comes back, and just this incredible man. So he goes out with me, and we go, and I dug up graves because I had to see in every fiber of my being. I smelled, if you've never smelt a corpse that is a human corpse that's rotted for 10 days, there is no dead animal in the world that smells as bad as a human corpse, I will guarantee you. And I went up and stood by it. I had to feel it all so that I could speak to this issue, because I was in a better position to speak to it. I did speak. The consequences, 2 newspapers on their front page called for my assassination. Krueger, un homme pour l'assassination. And I'm interfering in domestic affairs, and I deserve to be killed. So I didn't stop at that. I continued to go out, And then we had, and with this, I will give this experience, then I will close. My neighbor, Jean-Marie Ngendahayo, my closest friend there, he was actually sort of super Tutsi. He was what they called Ganwa. He came from the royal line, but he was on the Hutu side, the Frodo party, and he had been foreign minister, and he lived next door. And he said, Bob, since it's a parliamentary system, he represented Cibitoke, a western province, and parliament, and he was foreign minister. He said, I want to go. He said, there's been so much murdering. The army has been slaughtering so many people there. Shall we go? And I said, sure. You think it's safe? Let's go. And he said, well, I'll get an army escort, which was exactly the wrong thing to do, as it turned out. But so okay, picture one of the poorest countries in the world, a mountainous country, and a dirt road going up into the mountains, and we have an army escort. So up in the front there is a Mercedes truck painted in camouflage paint with about a dozen soldiers with AK-47s, and then there's a Jeep following it, and then with one of their Jeeps, the Army Jeep, and then the brother-in-law of the head of the Army, the brother-in-law of Colonel Bigamago is a lieutenant colonel, and he's in the next car, and then there's a little white United Nations Observer Jeep that's in front, and then my car, which is the only Chevrolet in the country, this white Chevrolet, and then there's another Toyota. Because of the various threats against me, they had sent a second security guard. Mind you, I lived in a residence that had a 10-foot wall, but there was no barbed wire. There was no armed guard anywhere. There wasn't a firearm in my whole place. Somebody could have crawled over and killed me, I guess, most any time, because there was a locally hired guy who had a club at the door, and the one time that anybody tried to get in, he ran off into the bananery and hid. So, but you had to pay 20 cents an hour. So that was the going rate. At any rate, so here we are, and excuse me 1 second. So we're going down the road, and all of a sudden, we hear this plop, 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 and Chris, the security guard, and I simultaneously say, flat tire. And we stop, and Eddie, we have a new driver. The other driver got to go to America after driving for 9 ambassadors. And this guy, the State Department didn't send to driver school because he had to save money. So anyway, he pulls right up behind, and then there's this car behind us. We're sitting there, and all of a sudden, Chris says, Jesus, it's gunfire. I'm seeing the car shake in front of me, and I look around, and our car is hit with bullets, and I look around with one bullet. It's about 18 inches away, but I value those 18 inches. So then I look behind, and Chris is in the front saying, Eddie, back up, Eddie, back up. Eddie is frozen, and he can't move. So Larry Salmon, who looks like a Marlboro man, I can see his long frame leaning out with his revolver trying to give some covering fire. And meanwhile, a car from behind comes up, and the driver passes out. And so in front of us, I'd seen this car rocking. Everybody in the car in front of me, everybody got hit. And this other car, and my United Nations Observer car stops there, and the security guard falls out dead there. So there are now 2 cars in front, and there's a fall 200 feet on that side. And so Chris has to take the steering wheel like this, put his foot out like that on the gas, and back up from this position because Eddie can't do anything. And we are sideswiping the whole way down because we don't want to fall off. The road is that narrow. And we get up, and there are the Burundi soldiers. They're just sort of walking around as if they had a promenade in Spain at 4 o'clock or something like that. They just it's, in other words, it's the army that sets up an ambush. To those who might be thinking of State Department recruiters, I had many battles with State Department. They didn't. Fortunately, it helps if the president likes you, and the president liked me, so I didn't worry too much about the other folks. But the State Department, felt that I was, I guess, too independent or something, and they gave they gave Valor Awards, thank goodness, to both Chris and to Larry Salmon. They never mentioned me at all, which is all right. I wasn't expecting a Valor Award, but it was interesting to go to the event, and they didn't even mention it. I think they were very unhappy that I was out there. But what happened was that after that, I knew that they would want to withdraw me, and I didn't want to withdraw, so I sent them a cable immediately, and I said, in Texas, if you fall off a horse, the first thing you do is get back on the horse. So we do that for two reasons. Number one, we don't want to have time to get scared ourselves. Number two, we want to show the horse who's boss. The worst thing you can do is pull me out, and the Army will decide all they have to do is shoot at the American ambassador and put a bullet through his car, and they'll pull out. So they did let me stay a time. Now, they then ultimately, several months later, they sort of tricked me and said, come home for consultations in the next plane. And I packed 2 suits. I thought I was just going home for consultations. They never let me go back. So I then went to Botswana, the most peaceful country. But I will put this footnote, even though it's self-congratulatory, I'm sorry, but I didn't go back for 12 years. 12 years later, in 2007, I left in 1995. In 2007, I went back to visit, because they were, I hope, just going to establish a new Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And by this time, with the help of Bill Clinton, but even much more Nelson Mandela, and some of the changes when I was there and others, democracy was established. And Burundi is now a democratic country, and it has been. It's had a democratic government. It's corrupt, but it's democratic, and the army no longer slaughters. So the genocide has ended in Burundi. And I knew that it was, there was absolute genocide going on when I was there. I went back after 12 years, and I was the lead story for 3 nights running on the local television. It was the main story. I'd met first with the president, and then the next morning the woman who's head of parliament wanted to meet with me, and she had all the cameras there, and then the person who was head of the lower house had all the cameras there. And when I walked, people cheered in the streets, and I wept. I wept tonight. I thought, God, this is all out of proportion. All that I did was speak the truth. And I haven't told that story very often. And I did tell it to a woman who taught a course in the Holocaust. And she said, no, that does not surprise me. She said, when people are punished, persecuted, imprisoned, killed, tortured, and nobody seems to care, then they think nobody cares at all. And she said, just to have one person speak for them gives them hope. Now, I never in my life thought I was going around give somebody a little bit of hope today. All that I was doing was trying to tell the truth of what happened and trying to reduce it. But I mention that because what I did was terribly unpopular in the State Department. I got an email from a high-level official at one point when I was reporting on all of the massacres that were going on by the Army, and she said, well, but we mustn't be seen to be taking sides, must we? And I thought, what in the hell? You can't take sides against genocide. What can you do? But that tends to be the modus operandi and the thought, never rock the boat. I would just urge those of you who may be training you in the Foreign Service, don't give up your identity. Don't give up your principles to a bureaucracy. That is a real risk because, you can float to the top maybe, but it's a float, and when you get there, you haven't really arrived. Thank you very much.
Professor Chabelle, first before we have House expert on immigration.
And you're right, and with the slides, so I'm glad that actually you address these two topics. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at the beginning you say, I don't know if there is any relationship between the two sections of my presentation today, and I think there is one.
Oh, well, good.
There is one, is poverty. Poverty, economic disparities. We know that poverty is one of the push factors for illegal immigration. You mentioned the gap between the US and Mexico. Actually, it's not the largest one. The largest one is between Morocco and Spain.
Oh,
and
okay. Well, I'm glad I'm glad I put some qualifier into it that I thought it was, okay, good.
And also poverty as a source of discrimination, a source of alienation, a source of resource competition. And you relate to that, so poverty identity, I think that's the two common thread when we try to address the issues of immigration in the US, but also in Europe. There are similarities. And also the situation in Central Africa. So I just wanted to thank you for your very comprehensive approach of how Americans perceived immigration issues, the distinction between illegal and legal migrants and everything. But I wanted to ask you one question that relates to this section. You mentioned a national card, and it's very reassuring. In most European countries, we have our ID. Okay? The problem is it doesn't address the issues raised by illegal immigration or the sense that immigrants, foreigners, broadly defined, pose a threat to national identity. I don't feel more French because I have a French ID. And most of my fellows distrust immigrants despite the fact that most of them are French citizens. So it doesn't solve. But what about visa policy? Is there any chance that the US will rethink visa policy? You say open, close door. The best way to open or to close the door is not border controls. We know that. It's not working. What about visa policy? 30% of illegal immigrants in this country are visa overstayer because they want to stay and work, and they're employed. So what about to reform visa policy, and what about an actual enforcement at working place where people hire illegal immigrants and they do that on purpose? So that's one question. If you think that, because we are at the crossroad, do you think that this aspect of the immigration reform is ripe, that we're ready to discuss that in the US today? Which relate to what what you experienced in Burundi was absolutely fascinating. But there is one question I really want to ask you, because the International Court for Rwanda published its report last month, and there is this debate. Genocide, was it planified, organized for years, or did it happen, out of the blue like that? And there are two sides of the debates. There is only one thing that everybody agreed on, is the economic situation. You mentioned the Belgium. You can add the French, okay? We can take it. I mean, we have a share of responsibility. You can add the UN. You say the State Department didn't want to take side. The UN didn't want to take side. I have the opportunity to discuss that with General Romeo Dallaire. He never recovered from his experience in Rwanda because he couldn't use the guns against the Hutu or the Tutsi. His job was to witness a genocide and to be held responsible for it. So what do you think about the involvement of the US in the International Criminal Court and in the Millennium Goals? They need money, not only to for economic reasons and so on, but for infrastructure, to create a real effective public administration. So when you went back in 2007, did you notice any progress?
Yes, there has been progress. Well, I mean, it's huge progress if people are no longer getting killed. That's a considerable progress. But you know, Burundi has not, its economy hasn't, you know, given the problems. Well, I mean, and what I didn't mention was when I was there, and I doubt that it's much better now. But it's somewhat better. 85% of the population was illiterate. So, and that was almost all Hutu. And so you had, you had a population that couldn't even read and write. And that's frankly, that made me be all the more amazed that 12 years after, when the median age was 14 when I was there, and the average lifespan 42, but so I thought, my gosh, 40% of these people weren't even born when I was here, and yet I get this response. So it obviously just having one person to speak meant something clearly to them, and they do have a stable government. I mean, it's not free of corruption, but Nelson Mandela, in good part, handled that, because when he was brought in by Clinton and others, we were moving toward more democracy. But once Mandela was in, you know, the man, you know, they talk about Madiba magic, and he really is kind of a magical presence, and you know, the South African army couldn't let him not succeed, and so he just set up a situation in which the military dictator, Buyoya, who'd been military dictator earlier times too, had a limit to his term with a Hutu vice president, and the Hutu vice president came in, and then elections came, and Buyoya was finished. So it is a democracy, and the killing is gone. The economy, you know, when people are that poor and that ignorant, and there are very few resources even for the, you know, the figures I had when I was there were that 85% of the population was just engaged in subsistence agriculture, just growing enough for themselves. And unfortunately, the families are extremely large. The birth is high, so they will still have many challenges, I'm afraid.
You're more optimistic about Burundi. That's democracy in Texas.
Yes, I am. Well, I mean, just for the killing to be gone, and for there to be some sort of democracy. And I did, frankly, I talked again when I went back in 2007. This is another personal note, but I went to see. I mean, the president immediately saw me, you know, within a couple of hours. But I'd met him before, but you know, I talked with him about, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I thought it was important. I went back in large part because I wanted to be on it if it was set up, because I felt I could represent an understanding of it, and I wanted to see it set up. And so I then went to see Colonel Buyoya, the head of the army, and not Buyoya, excuse me. Buyoya's previous dictator. Bikumagu, and his brother-in-law, who was in charge of the attack on our convoy. So I went to see Bikumagu, and I told him, I said, you know, I have seen so much suffering that I don't want to see anybody brought to trial. I said, I think what worked in South Africa was truth and reconciliation, with people making personal confession of what they had done and getting the forgiveness from the other party there. And, you know, I went to see him, and I didn't realize until after I left that the person who'd phoned for me to set up the meeting, because I didn't speak Kirundi, and my French was pretty poor by this time. He had actually told him, he'd told Bikumagu, Bikumagu said, why does he want to see me? And he said, well, he thinks you planned his assassination. But he said, oh no, ce n'est pas moi, c'est le bandame. It's the armed bands, it's all the time. But any rate, I didn't know that when I went to see him, and so, but I must say, I just felt pity for him. I thought, what a terrible, terrible life to lead, to go around just killing people all the time, and then living as Hitler must have lived, in constant fear that somebody's going to treat you the way you treated them. So he had to live in constant fear. But he was out, and the army now has, if you have a Tutsi colonel, you have a Hutu major, and it tears all the way down, yeah, and it's worked. And I've held up people for some period of time. I'm here to stay as long as you like, but
we have a little food outside. We should conclude this in one. I just wanted to say that what you did there was, as an individual, is very significant because unless people stand up one by one to confront evil, genocide, and don't pay any attention to, let's say, the bureaucracy, then these horrible patterns continue. And the way I think about it is that if unless we stand up, and genocide anywhere makes possible genocide everywhere. So really what you were doing was defending people not just in Burundi, but around the world. Because they know that somebody noticed, somebody stood up, somebody objected. That didn't happen very much in World War II. Genocides still happen around the world, but at least there are some people who are calling our attention.
And I have to say, I just couldn't do anything else. I could not have lived with myself had I remained silent. I just knew that there was risk. I mean, when it was more than once that the newspapers called for my assassination, and there were other things, but I didn't think they would try. They did try once and they missed. But I would also just mention that my wife, we had a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old daughter there at the time. My wife faced down 4 soldiers to protect the life of one of our workers at the embassy. She would normally drive home the Hutu workers because she would put a big American flag in the corner of her Pajero, and she would drive them so that the Tutsi youth gangs wouldn't attack them on the street. And the army had gone through and just sort of destroyed this village, or pillaged it certainly. And when she said, she left a message. She said, because Jean-Marie had fled up in the hills, and she left a message to somebody, tell him I'm coming tomorrow and I will take him, he can stay at the embassy and with his family. So she came back, and he was there, and he was showing her things. And then when they came back, there was an army truck that had come, and there were 4 soldiers that came up, and she didn't speak much French, but she did say, je suis le mari de l'ambassadeur américain. And so she just stood in a face-off, and they didn't move, and she didn't move for some time. And finally, after about 5 minutes, the commander, said something, and he walked off.
I think what you and your wife done is the epitome of public service. So you were really an icon of public service to us, and we'd like to thank you. Edward and I have just prepared this certificate.
Thank you
for
very much.
To remember us.
Thank you.
We will remember what you have said for many, many
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
for
you
your
all. Let's
patience.
give him. Thank you all for being here. We have some refreshments outside.